Hi, welcome to the Playtyper Guy podcast. I'm Stephen Robinson. Joining me is my friend Evan Stern of the Certain Thoughts Substack. How are you, Evan?
Excellent. It's great to see you again.
I am so excited you'd reached out to me to discuss my favorite play of all time, Angels in America. You have recently watched the 2003 miniseries. Um, I really want to get your thoughts about this. Um, I remember seeing the miniseries when it came out. I grew up in the 1980s, so was alive in my childhood during the AIDS epidemic, the Reagan years. I have very kind of clear, found formative memories of that time. I am interested in sort of what you recall of the period and of the media about sort of gayness and the AIDS epidemic and sort of other films that have been made about it, specifically like say Philadelphia, and just what your thoughts are. So yeah, please tell me. I mean, what inspired you to sit down and watch it, and what were your thoughts?
Yeah, I this has been on my list. It should have been something that I watched a lot a long time ago. I was born in '84, so I don't have any real memories of the moment in which the play occurs. But I do remember in the early 2000s when the HBO miniseries came out and won all these awards, and it was a sensation, and it stayed in the zeitgeist for me for a long time. But it was never something that I cared to come back to until relatively recently. I've been on a little bit of an Al Pacino kick and going back and watching some of the films that he was in that I hadn't previously seen. Of course, I've seen the bigger name, The Godfather, some of these other Heat, but I went back, and when I realized this was on that list, this was part of my incomplete Al Pacino curriculum. I said, "Well, this is part of my larger incomplete curriculum," and so I wanted to watch it, and I was completely blown away. It's it one reaction. What I have so many thoughts. One reaction is watching this in 2026, seeing something that was made in the late 90s or early 2000s feels very much of that time, but it takes place in the 80s, so it's sort of like a late 90s, early 2000s depiction of the mid 80s. But the story itself, I know the play originally went live in 1993. So and this might be where you can help me understand is like how did the adaptation change from the original play, both in terms of from stage to screen, but also from that moment in the early 90s to nearly a decade later. So I was really interested in that. I was, yes, amazed by Pacino's depiction of Roy Cohn. All of the performances are amazing. I also watched The Apprentice not that long ago, and I knew about McCarthyism when I was young and growing up in a sort of lefty Jewish environment in my world. McCarthyism and Joe McCarthy he was one of the great sort of villains, and understanding the resurgent villain narrative of Roy Cohn in the Trump era, and watching Jeremy Strong's incredible depiction of Roy Cohn in The Apprentice, it was really exciting for me to watch the Pacino version of this, and also then thinking, well, how did this piece of film art, this piece of TV art, influence The Apprentice?
Yeah.
So I don't have any real memories of that moment, but I will just leave you with the earliest AIDS related memory that I have. I remember being in fifth grade. So this would have been around 94, 95. And I remember being in the boys' bathroom in my school. And some student said to me something about you can't sit on the same toilet seat as somebody else because that's how you get AIDS.
Mhm.
And I remember, even in my very young age, understanding that HIV was transmissible through blood, and that although it may not be pleasant or sanitary to share a toilet seat with somebody, that was not the reality of it. But so I all these years later, I'm 42 now, I think back, and that's still a vivid memory for me. And that's the first. So clearly I had some prior understanding at that point to be able to make sense of it. But I remember even back then, it was like there was a lot of misunderstanding and a lot of fear and a lot of anxiety. But again, that was all the way into the early 90s after the play had already gone live.
Yeah, and I have a decade on you. So I was born in 1974, and so when the play takes place, I was 11 in the 80s. I was aware of this because you could not, and sort of growing up in 80s, there was that fear of this disease, and the fear leading to sort of this marginalization of the queer community, of gay men in particular, of being sort of, even in, I think you look at the Times referring to sort of GRID, gay related immune disease, in these terms, making a sort of already vulnerable group even more marginalized, as like a threat, and being a lot like, and when sort of people were coming out in ways related to AIDS. So Rock Hudson, I remember when he came out and um, having AIDS, and other folks. And one of the things that was sort of consistent, which I think goes to the play, that the play does very well, is sort of humanizing, especially if you weren't gay, or if you weren't, obviously knew no one of AIDS, humanizing these people and their struggle, or people with AIDS, in ways that just you weren't always seeing. It was sort of, in my own experience, it was sort of, as Prior Walter, the character, they said, we won't have silent, shameful deaths. Like, that affirmation he's making was something that was in response to a lot of what was happening, and that you were sort of, in the Reagan era especially, was occurring. And as a result was the scary time, because there was not a lot of knowledge about how it was being spread, who could be infected, or affected. And what I think this play does well is to sort of show that, but also, um, the sort of sensitivity of the humanity of people with this, even someone as inhuman as Roy Cohn, right? Like, of everything. So, what also strikes me thinking about it, especially at this point in time, is, because of how the play begins, like, it is obviously, in Kushner's background, it's a very, the Jewish heritage is also very much part of this as well. Like, did you sort of get that sense of when watching this, and sort of that being a very big part of it as well?
Yes, the Jewish energy of Kushner, his the way that he understands and processes, in Judaism, in the Jewish community, there's regular daily observance, and there's weekly ritual like Shabbat, and annual things like the high holidays and the Passover ceremony. But the life cycle events are really things that kind of bring community together, bring families together: death, birth, bar mitzvah, weddings. And the fact that the play starts out at a funeral, and it's a rabbi, and then it you know the moment in the film, and I don't know if this happens on stage as well, where the Belize character asks Lewis to say the Kaddish, the mourner's Kaddish, and Lewis, who is a secular Jew who doesn't even know the words, he hears the voice of the ghastly, Ethel Rosenberg, who has been haunting Roy Cohn, stays around and gives Lewis the words. And so it's all very intra-Jewish, but it as much as I felt the deep Jewish roots of this play, this also felt like such a New York play, such
Oh
a
yeah.
New York story. And it's funny how you mention the Jewish element, and to my mind, it's like, well, these two are so deeply entwined, and there's a San Franciscan energy and story, and there's so the cities of San Francisco and New York are sort of the two poles of this story,
Mhm.
and the New York side is that it's like it's the Jewish side.
Well,
I
New York culture and Jewish culture are so entwined. And as someone who grew up in the South, it was kind of, I was talking to a good friend of mine who was Jewish, it was like how of like what I coming into about this awareness, it was sort of, especially in media, what I associate New York is these things that are very sort of, as you say, sort of a Jewish energy or a Jewish culture without my even kind of understanding it, right? Because it's sort of was often sort of coded. Like obviously, it seems silly to not think that. Well, obviously, Woody Allen is Jewish, and these things are. But like, if you're if you're like a 12-year-old watching these movies, you're just like, oh, this is New York, right? And you're not processing that. And I think a lot of it is part of that. And then San Francisco, certainly the queerness, and Belize, yeah, definitely as a queer black man, he sort of has that energy. He's not sort of, even if he's not sort of necessarily from San Francisco, but
Yeah,
you
and
know.
I want to get more into the Belize of it all, who feels like such the heart and soul
Oh
of it.
yeah.
But I do have to say, for me, like I've still never seen Philadelphia, and I remember that winning awards and that being a sensation. But I do remember when Rent came out,
Hmm.
and when I was in middle school, Rent was the thing, and everybody wanted to see the show and go to New York to see it on Broadway. And then when it started touring, I remember the the plot the plot arc in Forrest Gump, where I believe one of the characters, I think Jenny, is
As a
HIV.
yeah.
Yeah, and you mentioned Rock Hudson. I mean, to me, it was the reveal that the Magic Johnson was HIV.
Yeah.
Was a major, and I think for a lot of kind of straight kids like me, that was like, oh, this is a. But I say all of that to reflect that Rent is not a Jewish play,
No.
and the way that Angels in America very much is. And so but it still takes place in New York. It's still multicultural. It still has all this commentary about the country. It's still, fun and irreverent, but also politically sharp. And there's class, and so there's a lot there. But it doesn't have this intense layer
Sure.
of the Jewish life cycle and the prayers that Kushner puts into this.
Well, and Deaf Hots, obviously, both in, you know, Ginny is doomed in Forrest Gump. Tom Hanks' character dies in Philadelphia, and it's sort of, it presents, which did happen, this sort of this vibrant man wasting away, which, as someone from the black community growing up, when I was like 17 at the time, and I was remembering, the folks of my relatives, you know, aunts, my mom weeping, even my dad, because the expectation was he's going to die, and he's going to waste away and die. It was that sense of, oh my God, right? And what I think the play does, without not denying the fact that, AIDS was at the time, considered a death sentence for people, but it ends on a very different note from a lot of most stories of time about AIDS, because
Mm-hmm.
Pryor is alive, at the end, and he has the last word, and there's a hopefulness that I think stands out the most from most things about AIDS of that period, of my own experience of watching stuff. It was like he is going to live. Who knows for how long, which is true
Yeah.
of all of us, right? But he is alive at the end.
Yeah, yeah, that speaks to something that you were highlighting earlier, which is how much how effectively the play humanizes and makes accessible, this core struggle between Lewis and Pryor, where the prior character gets they get a fatal diagnosis, and their partner Lewis can't handle it, and he
Mhm.
leaves. And this is, I think, uh, a brutal and excruciating story, but it's something that I think a lot of people can identify with. It's happened in their family, it's happened in their communities. We've seen it. I think we all understand what it looks like to be either really sick or on your, in a terminal position, and to have somebody stand by you, but
Mhm.
also what it can look like when somebody can't handle that. And
Yeah.
by making an HIV diagnosis that catalyst for this point of crisis in this relationship, it's like, well, everybody can understand that. And I also think the scene where where Roy Cohn freaks out and lashes out at Joe, at his mentee, when Joe, who Roy has treated like a father, who he gives the fatherly blessing. He right again with with Kushner imparting these Jewish traditions, and Roy Cohn gives Joe the fatherly blessing even after he's basically betrayed him, even after Joe has walked away from the opportunity of a lifetime, and to be a corrupt actor on Cohn's behalf inside the federal government. But he's still, and so Joe, who has come around to recognizing that he is in fact gay, he's going to this person who loves him, who is taking him under his wing, and he wants to come out to Roy, and because Roy Cohn has a deeply conflicted and dangerous and problematic relationship with his own gayness. He lashes out, and when he does, he rips the drips out of his arms, right? Because he's in the hospital. And as a result, like, his blood starts flowing all over the place, and it gets on Joe's shirt, and it gets on the floor. And I think this is such an important scene because this is the thing that is so terrifying. And we have, again, the prior character, I'm sorry, the Belize character, and played by Jeffrey Wright, the nurse, who also is this angel, and is this friend, and is this confidant, and does hold power accountable. But in that moment, Belize, the nurse, addresses the situation responsibly. He doesn't freak out. He doesn't, he is the center of calm in this moment. And the drama is this tension between this father and son, and loving people the way they are versus not being able to love them for who they are. But the actual danger of the reality of that exposure to Cohn's blood is handled in such a way. And you see him putting the gloves on, and you see him reacting quickly because it is an emergency situation, and telling Joe what to do with the blood-soaked shirt, and coordinating a scene where he both protects the patient and gets him back in a position where he has to, but he also handles the biohazard risk and gets everything cleaned up so nobody is further exposed to HIV. I thought that was such an important scene because it's like, until that moment in the story, we are seeing gay lovers have gay sex. I mean, it's not blue, but we're seeing lovers have gay sex where one of them is an effect, and it's like, okay, this is oral sex. Like, you can see the processing of, like, there is a safe way to have sex when one of these partners is HIV positive, and that's really important. But now we're in a situation where, like, this is actually somebody could catch HIV directly, and like, just demonstrating this is how a situation like that would be handled and is handled. And that, like, demystified it even to me, right? I grew up with this, and I understand this, and I have, I think a really, like, informed relationship to the nature of this illness and its risks and how it's handled in a medical situation. But even, like, that scene really helped me to better understand how this is actually handled in the real world.
Mhm.
And the play is filled with moments like that.
Well, and Kushner, it's a bold choice. A lot of productions don't do, of showing a partner unable to handle essentially this drastic shift, and it's just in the sense of, my partner's going to get very ill and I cannot handle this. Um, and also still wanting us to obviously identify enough and care enough about Lewis to continue following his journey. That's a very tough thing to do. And I think it's handled well. He also, which I think becomes relevant in our current politics, um, Lewis and Belize's, sort of kind of competing liberal politics. Belize is a black man. Um, you know, uh, you almost there was I remember with Ezra Klein with Ta-Nehisi Coates. Their debate is a very that it's sort of that kind of debate of like someone similar liberal, minorities of liberal politics, but one has a different perspective, one has another, and how that is sort of an interesting forms of interesting conflicts and hilarious scenes. Some of some of the best scenes are between Lewis and Belize,
Yeah.
and how to me that holds up so well because it's sort of a conflict that perhaps is not that will never go that perhaps will never go away.
Yeah, it is.
Um,
It is timeless. I loved those scenes. I love the way that Belize. It, Belize is who we all want to be, right? Belize is
mhm,
somebody who can be loving and sympathetic and say a prayer for and hold like Belize doesn't just hold Roy Cohn um, when he's in mortal terror and sobbing and calling for his mother because that's his job as a nurse. It's because he can't turn off his humanity. And even when he hates Lewis and has every reason to do so, not just for being an insufferable liberal, but for abandoning their mutual friend and being a bad gay, like he still will sit with him and call him to his better self. I mean, there is a ethos, I think, behind this whole story, which is that nobody is irredeemable, nobody should be permanently canceled. Even the great Satan himself, Roy Cohn, is somebody whose humanity we must like continue to honor and remember. And so that is I find myself challenged and bristling
mhm,
by that very assertion. But the actual political conversations or the interpersonal uh, uh, the interpersonal struggle between these two people, it also is part of Kushner's brilliance, writing a particular Jewish liberal type into the Lewis character. And that's not to say that Jewish liberals have a monopoly on the kind of masturbatory uh, way that we see him. And granted, like the diner scene where they're getting together and Lewis is in crisis and he's kind of manic and he's talking, right? But what he's doing, he is also at the same time engaging in political theory and political philosophy as a purely intellectual pursuit. Like for him,
mhm,
it's just interesting. It's an act of pleasure. And he's talking in the abstract about different systems but he's also talking about race and privilege. And for Belize, these are very real, very tangible, very practical things. And so there's this really remarkable juxtaposition between somebody for whom this doesn't ever really seem to matter other than like as an academic pursuit versus somebody for whom all these things, and not just for him, but like he's speaking to an experience. And it's not just the Black experience, but that happens to be something that Lewis is particularly blind to as a New York intellectual, in the 80s, in the 90s, in the era in which the story is written. And at the end, like, they're all still friends. That was also something that I really appreciated. Like, this can apply to anybody for sure, but as somebody who grew up with gay parents, you know, my parents divorced when I was young. My dad comes out of the closet, you know, so I have a stepfather in my life for more than 30 years. So I have some relationship to, you know, the gay community and the gay male community in particular. And seeing how at the end, like, Pryor does what he has to do. Lewis is begging to come back. He seemed to finally had some sort of moral reckoning with what he did. He does seem somewhat genuine in his apology, in his appreciation for how he betrayed his partner in his time of need. And even then, Pryor also has the clarity that he still can't have him back. But what we see with that epilogue is they're still clearly friends. They still clearly care about each other.
Mhm.
And again, not that this doesn't happen in the straight community, but I really appreciate how it's like when you look at gay men, it's like, okay, or in the queer community in general, it's like, well, I'm friends with this person, that person. Like, maybe we fucked around, maybe we dated, you know, but these people in the story, like, this person is not, has foreclosed their privilege to be my partner, to sleep in my
Sure.
bed, to live in my house. But I still care immensely about them. And Belize is like, he's the moral core and the social conduit that holds all of that together.
And I think that ending, obviously, Joe is not present for a reason, and I think that is sort of consistent. I think when we talk about our politics now, so even if you and I might disagree on certain issues, we ultimately we have an agreement on a larger scale, so that we're fighting for the same thing, and and so that's sort of how I would like to see left leaning. I don't always see that with the left. I often see sort of like, well, we should be on the same side. Why are we treating each other as enemies? And why are you more inclined? Like, sometimes it seems as if you're more inclined to um sort of like, there are certain ways where, let's say, Lewis and Joe have more in common than Lewis and Belize, right? But ultimately, Joe is represented from their confrontation, right? Like, here's everything you've done that is I can't get past, because you've enabled a lot of terrible things. So it's not just that you're flawed and you're trying to get there, like, the road you're taking is a completely horrible one, as opposed to, I think even Belize could say, Lewis can be annoying, Lewis can be mad, all these sort of things, but ultimately we're on the same road. What's your take on that, and especially in our current politics as well?
Yeah, and I just have to apologize if you hear noises. I'm currently cat sitting, so they're also quite active. So occupational hazard. Lewis is intolerable because he thinks he's a good guy, who in many ways is not a good guy. And part of what is so irritating with a lot of folks who do care about liberal values, who care about liberal policy outcomes, who want the world to be a better place, and genuinely conceive of themselves being sort of in the good fight or on the good side of history, are for any number of reasons can actually be operating, counterproductive to those goals. But they are genuine in their desire to achieve outcomes that folks, much more to their left or have a different take on things. And so you're right. Like Pryor can, Belize can appreciate that he and Lewis are in coalition, even if Lewis is drastically in need of some humility and some education and some history and some lived experience, but that they are in coalition. Whereas Joe is not. He's not. And it's interesting because the epilogue takes place, about 5 years after the events of the play, and he's not in the frame. But I don't think the worldview of the play forecloses the fact that 5 or 10 or 15 years later he might not eventually come back into the frame. Cohn picks him because he is an agent of the devil. And we see this very satisfying. It's very satisfying the way Kushner writes it into the third act. It's really the beginning of the third act of the story. This reveal. Lewis has gone and done the research, and what he has determined is not only is this somebody who Roy Cohn has taken under his wing, but he finds the actual judicial decisions that Joe has written, and they are very they are the actual decisions that reaffirm a lack of constitutional protections, a lack of civil rights for gay people. And so what Lewis identifies is that Cohn may or may not have knew that Joe was gay, but probably did on some level, and chose him precisely because here was a very formidable legal mind who the right could use to take away gay rights, even though he himself was gay, and could find the actual legal machinations to get a circuit court or federal Supreme Court to make those decisions. And so Lewis calls him on that. He calls him on the connection to McCarthyism and who Roy Cohn is. And it's still an interpersonal reckoning, and there's this shame about, I fucked around and I was vulnerable with this person who is my enemy. But they get into this heated physical confrontation. I mean, it's a brutal fight. And Joe lashes out at him because Lewis has called his number and identified him for who he is and the role that he plays in opposition to liberalism. And so he's got a long way to come. And yeah, he's not part of the coalition and he's not part of that final scene. But again, I don't think that the play necessarily writes out a future where he somehow tries to come around and own up for his mistakes. And maybe that is what's happening. Maybe that is what he's doing in his own time. But the blood is just too bad on the other side.
But that would be changing what I too often see, and when I would like to now potentially start discussing Lindsey Graham, who just passed away as we're recording this, because often the perspective, and I see this from the left, is sort of, oh, well, Joe is representing a point of view vigorously, and we respect that point of view. And that's what America is about, is that he has this point of view, and that is good. And sort of, I don't want to be dismissive of quote unquote identity politics, because sometimes that's how that's often used. I will say over the past year, I have been increasingly more intolerant of how certain center left mainstream Democrats have been using it as a shield and a cudgel. So, hey, look, these white leftists saying that Hakeem Jeffries shouldn't be speaker, they're racist. It's like, well, no, they are. Look at what these kids believe. They obviously, it's not just that they're racist. Like, what? Why shouldn't they? And you're making it about Jeffries' race other than what he believes. And I think here it's not just, oh, we're both gay people, let's respect each other, even though you disagree on these fundamental things. It's like, that's a ridiculous form of, that's not a coalition. That's not a community. That's same with, me and Brian Donald's like, oh, we're both Black. We have something major in common. Well, you disagree on fundamental things. You and I have more in common as far as how we see the world. Right. And that tends to be sort of where kind of my politics go. And I kind of respect the idea that it is not this idea that because I've seen so many things, I think even the West Wing has done this, right? Where the idea is that you have to respect Joe's position. He's
Yeah.
he's a principled conservative. And he is. He's a nice guy, right? He's not like Trump. He's not insulting. He's not a bad guy. He's he would, and he's around the same age as I think Alito, based on the play, I think he'd be around the same age as Alito and Roberts. And he's someone who'd be on the Supreme Court, and we should respect. He's a principled guy, right? It's like, well, no, he believes in things that are terrible and do harm to other people. And I like that the play does sort of call that out. I think the landmine scene, for instance, when they're discussing, there's no, it's such a a revelatory prescient scene of essentially this is how we're going to roll back the New Deal. This is how we're going to roll back the rights revolutions through the courts. And it's exactly what happened. So whenever I go back to that scene, I'm like, oh my God, Kushner called it, and I wish more people had paid attention, because it's like right there. It's like, this is what they're doing. And Joe, as you say, is doing it at that, junior level, but he's a key part of it because, the judge he's writing opinions for is brain dead. So
the way the way Joe shows up on his own terms for his own moral reckoning really hammers home the point that it is genuinely held for these folks that are ripping apart our Constitution. Joe's resistance to taking the position in the Justice Department is not ideological. He's not opposed to the project of repealing the New Deal. He's not opposed to the project of seating all these courts with revanchist, revisionist judges, and then picking away and seeing exactly what has come to pass. That he has no problem with that. He has a problem with the corruption. He has a problem with the fact that he's being asked personally to violate the law in a way that weaponizes the executive branch against a state level independent operation, right? About who can and cannot be a practicing member of the bar. So for him, it's absolutely not. He has no problem with that project, but he does have intense moral boundaries where he feels that there is some sort of corruption or violation of the law. And so that is true for him. But I think in this moment, certainly 20 some years on from the program on HBO, 30 some years on from the play, 40 some years on from the moment in which the story itself occurs in the Reagan era, we have to say, like, there is a harm done to our sense of what can be done, to our sense of where our politics should go, to our sense of how we should relate to each other, to our sense of what is just foundationally American and constitutional. There's a harm done when we extend this benefit of the doubt, when we extend this good faith presumption, when we say that something that is deeply held is worth taking seriously and respecting on its own terms. And the originalism, this total legal fiction that was invented, this concept of originalism, which is that there is some original intent from the framers, whether it's written or whether we can divine it from what we think they may have wanted. It should be this jurisprudential baseline through which to decide certain things about our world 250 years later, has been exposed over and over and over again to be completely fallacious. And when the court has the opportunity to rule in a way that's going to advance their illiberal goals, that is in line with so-called originalism, then they lean on originalism.
Yeah.
But when the decision requires completely cutting against so-called originalism, they just ignore it.
Mm-hmm. So, but that's the genius of the play. Like, it's insane. Like, for me, it's every time if you read something and it's just like, wait, did Kushner write? Did he have a time machine or something? Like, that to me is true genius of just getting something. These discussions that we're having about the Supreme Court, about corruption versus benign conservatism is represented by, like, again, it could be like someone writing it about now. Okay, that was part one of my Angels in America discussion with Evan Stern. Join us next time for part two.